Happy Wednesday, everyone. I'm holding in my hands a copy of The Hero with a Thousand Faces by Joseph Campbell. I've been rereading and relearning about the hero's journey and the myth of the hero, and I'm going to start today by reading about the first stage of the mythological journey, which is the call to adventure. The call to adventure is obviously when the journey begins. It's when the hero gets pulled from their ordinary world into the extraordinary world, and we take off on an adventure. Bilbo leaves the Shire and goes adventuring with a band of dwarves. Keanu Reeves leaves his desk job and gets pulled into the Matrix. Harry Potter is sad and lonely in his little cupboard closet room when he receives a letter, an invitation to the School of Hogwarts delivered by an owl. Ned Stark is at home in Winterfell and everything is peaceful and the war is over and life is good. And then the king, Robert Baratheon, rides up to Winterfell and invites Ned to come south with him to be the hand of the king and to leave his family and to leave his home and to strike off from the familiar into the unfamiliar, into the uncomfortable. Here is a little bit of what Joseph Campbell says about this first stage in the hero's journey, which is the call to adventure. The first stage of the mythological journey, which we have designated the call to adventure, signifies that destiny has summoned the hero and transferred his spiritual center of gravity from within the pale of his society to a zone unknown. This fateful region of both treasure and danger may be variously represented as a distant land, a forest, a kingdom underground, beneath the waves or above the sky, a secret island, lofty mountaintop, or profound dream state. But it is always a place of strangely fluid and polymorphous beings, unimaginable torments, superhuman deeds, and impossible delight. The hero can go forth of his own volition to accomplish the adventure, as did Theseus when he arrived in his father's city, Athens, and heard the horrible history of the Minotaur. Or he may be carried or sent abroad by some benign or malignant agent, as was Odysseus, driven about the Mediterranean by the winds of the angered god Poseidon. The adventure may begin as a mere blunder, as did that of the princess of the fairy tale, or still again, one may be only casually strolling when some passing phenomenon catches the wandering eye and lures one away from the frequented paths of man. Examples might be multiplied ad infinitum from every corner of the world. Well, goddamn, Joseph Campbell. For me, there's nothing better than adventures. When it comes to fiction, you can take your comedies, you can take your romances, you can take your murder mysteries, but for me, the true, that's the heart of fiction. All those other genres, they're all adventures. A romance is an adventure of a relationship that follows a certain arc that's familiar to us. The two characters who don't know each other, who go through the awkward phases of meeting and then growing closer and closer and closer before they have a big sad split, and then going into the depths of despair and frustration until finally getting back together in the end and having the happily ever after moment. That's an adventure. Comedies are adventures too, even if you think of, whatever the silliest comedy movie is that you can think of. What's a famous Will Ferrell movie? Step Brothers is a adventure more along the lines of the romance or the relationship adventure that I just described, where two male adults who are basically, they're like infantile, they never grew up. These two goofballs who still live with their parents get married and they're forced to move in together as brothers. So then they go through the whole relationship arc of at first they don't like each other, and then they find a common ground, and then they get closer and closer and closer until they have a really big disagreement. It's kind of like the buddy cop thing, like the what are those old Mel Gibson buddy cop movies that were famous in the 80s? Lethal Weapon, the Lethal Weapon series with the two cops who are different and don't like each other, but they're forced to work together for their own common good. That's what Step Brothers reminds me of. It's an adventure, but it's a relationship adventure, not unlike a romance. And then what's another just trying to think of silly comedies that are the way that adventure permeates all fiction. Elf, which is one of the greatest Christmas movies of all time. Elf is a more traditional adventure in the sense that Buddy the Elf grows up on the North Pole, and then he actually leaves his home and goes to New York City. So it's brilliant if you think about it, because New York City is the common world and the regular world for the viewer, but for Buddy the Elf, whose home is the North Pole and whose common everyday experience is making toys in the workshop for Santa Claus, his adventure, his out of this world supernatural experience is when he travels to Manhattan. And so that's funny to watch him in Manhattan and experiencing the regular world to us, but it's a foreign, strange world to him. And he's getting hit by taxis and he doesn't know how to use the escalator, and all this silly stuff is happening to him. But that story is actually more of a true to form adventure, because he actually goes to the strange land on a quest. His quest is to meet his father, and then he meets with all the trials and tribulations, and in the end he succeeds and he develops a relationship with his father. And what do you know, along the way he also happens to fall in love with a beautiful girl and kind of adopt a new family, develop a new family and set of friendships. And then at the end you always have the return back to home, where we see Buddy the Elf back in the North Pole, and now he's become a man. He's got a wife, he's got a kid, he's found his way in the world, and he's taken the knowledge that he got from his adventure, from his world travels, and he's brought that back home to help his community. I guess the call to adventure, since I started this off by talking about the call to adventure, for Buddy the Elf, I guess the call to adventure was in the beginning. The place where the story starts is that he finds out that he's not really an elf, and his the guy who he thought was his dad tells him that, Buddy, I'm not really your dad, and you're not really an elf. So that's the call to adventure for Buddy the Elf, is that his commonplace world is interrupted, is turned on its head. The thin layer of ice that keeps us all in the known world, he breaks through. This is what happens whenever you lose your job, or you suddenly get divorced, or you something unexpected happens to you. You fall from the known world, you fall through that thin layer of ice, and now you're in the dark depths of the ocean of terror, which is chaos. And chaos is when you don't know who you are anymore, and you don't know what your job is and who your relationships are with and who you really are, and you're just lost, and you could be anything, and that sort of chaos is terrifying, and that's why nobody wants to go on an adventure, because it actually is scary and involves soul searching and involves coming face to face with all those dangers. And what's fun reading, I was just looking at The Hero with 1,000 Faces. As soon as the call to adventure happens, one of the most common next steps is the refusal of the call. And I think that's important to remember, because so often when we think about these stories, we imagine that there's the call to adventure and the hero just leaps off on the journey and the hero just jumps to the call and he goes off and saves the day. But what really happens in real life is that when we're confronted with that chaos, when Buddy the Elf finds out that his dad is not his real dad and that he has a different dad, he doesn't just jump at the chance to leave. It's scary to leave. You don't want to leave nobody wants to leave their home and their friends and their safety. Nobody wants to be told that their home is not really their home anymore. And so it's common, if a storyteller tells the story in a way that's true to real life, then there's almost always going to be a refusal to the call. If you think about it as a literal phone call, if you got called up today and someone asked you to go on an adventure, well, the first thing you would do is you would think about all the sacrifices that you would make, and you would think of all the excuses, the good excuses that you have why you wouldn't want to go on this adventure. Well, first of all, I have to work today, and second of all, what is my family going to think if I just take off on this adventure, and third of all, what's going to happen to me? And you would start to list off all those excuses, and that's what happens in real life. If you think about Bilbo living peacefully at home in the Shire, when Gandalf arrives and has the party, he puts the note on the door, so one night all the dwarves show up. Bilbo, what's so funny about those early scenes is that Bilbo is totally out of sorts. He's just rushing around trying to provide bread and drink and food for all these crazy house guests that he has all of a sudden, and he hates all of it. It's all chaos, it's all an interruption, it's all uninvited, and he doesn't he's a hobbit, he's a creature of comfort, and all this stuff, that all what's happening to him is an intrusion, and it's a big pain in the ass. Bilbo just isn't having it. So of course, when Gandalf pitches to him this idea that you're going to come along with us, well, of course he's not going to jump at that idea. Of course he's not going to say, okay, great, and pack his bags. That's not how it really works. Usually there's some evasion. The hero evades the call to adventure, and then that makes, if there's a true refusal, if there's a believable refusal where we see the hesitation of the hero, then that makes it all the more heroic and wonderful when they actually do accept the call, because they then have to, when they go on the adventure, they have to take some responsibility for themselves and they have to face danger. And so that's actually heroic. That's when character is built, and that's when lessons are learned, and that's when wisdom is gained. So for me, there's just nothing better than an adventure. And that's why I love fantasy stories and fiction stories, because there's nothing more. That Bilbo story where he leaves the Shire and goes off adventuring through the mountains and overland and across the waters and fighting dragons, it's so archetypical to leave your home and go into the land of wonder. And that's what Joseph Campbell is talking about here when he's mentioning the examples of Odysseus and Theseus, and saying that the fateful region of both treasure and danger may be represented in a million different ways. It's a distant land, it's a forest, it's a mountaintop, it's a dream state, but it's always, he says there's always polymorphous beings There's always unimaginable torments, there's always superhuman deeds, and there's always impossible delight. So it's not that it's not that the unknown world holds all terrors. It's not all goblins and dragons. There's also beautiful wonders, beautiful sights, the types of pleasure that you couldn't even imagine back in your regular home life. And that's why it's so amazing that Joseph Campbell says, this fateful region of both treasure and danger. So that's the amazing thing about the adventure, is that there is danger and there's treasure. They go hand in hand together. You go off seeking the gold, but you can't get the gold without the danger. And that's why The Hobbit is such an amazingly archetypical story that's based off these Norse myths and old European myths, where's the gold found? The gold is inevitably found underneath the dragon. The gold is found in the dragon's lair, and that goes all the way back to Jung and archetypes and psychology, where to find the most valuable thing, we have to go to the most dangerous place. To find the thing that truly holds value for us, the true wisdom, the true unlocking of the secret, to get there, we have to go and stare into the face of the void and fight the if you think of just an old video game like Zelda or Mario or one of the classic hero video games, you always have to fight the most terrible bad guy at the end. And video games are good at following that call to adventure progress, where you go from level to level, literally from each stage to a new stage, and at each stage you're fighting progressively worse and scarier and more difficult bad guys until you get to the ultimate guy at the end, which is a dragon. And it's interesting, I've never thought about this before, but it's telling that Mario's ultimate enemy is Bowser, who looks like a dragon. He's like a big scary turtle with spikes on his shell, but he's representative of the dragon. And what does the dragon guard? The dragon guards the gold. And for Mario and the Mario Bros, that's this is calling me back to my childhood days thinking about this. They're always trying to save the princess, right? So she's the gold. Mario's call to adventure is to save the princess, and of course you cannot save the princess unless you fight and slay the dragon. And if it was easy, then everybody would do it. Everybody would be a hero, but it's not easy, and no one actually wants to take those risks because we're all cozy in our regular lives and we're all happy going through our routines. And that's not because we're all weak and cowardly and lazy and unwilling. It's just because we're smart. You'd be a fool to rush off on a new adventure every day, because adventures really are dangerous, and the majority of us don't want to take those risks. And that is actually smart to calculate the risks, because I guess the difference is that in real life, the hero isn't guaranteed to save the day, and that's what's called a tragedy. If you want to get back to Archetypes and Joseph Campbell and the origins of, or the deeper meanings of these things, a tragedy is when the hero doesn't save the day, or when a relationship goes through all those progressions and then in the end it just falls apart instead of having the happily ever after ending. And a tragedy is death, and a tragedy is pain, and a tragedy is when the hero is unable to meet to the call of adventure. The hero is unable to accomplish what they need to accomplish and make the necessary changes, and it ends up being their demise. And tragedies are entertaining too, but not for not for the main character who's living through them. What's interesting to me to think about, I love talking about how our lives are stories, and I like thinking about my own life as a story, and thinking about my friends and my family members and what our story arcs are. And what's one thing that's fascinating to me is thinking about what are all those calls to adventure that you've had in your life. Could have literally been a phone call or an email or a friend asking you to do something, or some place where you saw that there was a need. And you can't answer all those calls to adventure, and most of the time we try to answer as few of them as possible. And that's why we usually, in real life, we're more likely to embark on these adventures when they're thrust upon us. And that goes back to the analogy that I used of standing on the ice in the known world, in the comfortable world, and then suddenly that ice breaks through and you fall down into chaos. That's when you lose your job. That's when your parents kick you out of the house. That's when you're a teenager and you get pregnant accidentally and suddenly you're a father or a mother. That's when you're a kid or a teenager and your parents decide to move and suddenly you're living in a whole new country that you didn't want to go to, an adventure that you didn't want to be on. And those are the most common types of adventures that I think that we go through in our regular lives, are adventures that are sort of thrust upon us. And then the funny thing about that, the yin and the yang, the terror and also the beauty of that adventure is that if we are able to face up to it, if we are able to answer the call, and we are able to make the necessary changes and look danger in the eye and find the power that is within us, then we might actually be able to defeat the enemy that's in front of us and get the treasure that's buried in the lair, which is not going to be gold. It's going to be a self-realization. It's going to be a new friendship. It's going to be some sort of new relationship that we didn't know we could have or that we didn't know we were capable of. We're going to find some other magical object that's hidden in there, which is maybe a tool that we can use in life going forward. It's a new kind of confidence. It's a new kind of strength. It's a new kind of charisma, something that we achieve or something that we gain and add to our person because we've been through that trial. But it just makes so much sense to me when you think about it, that adventures are scary and most of us don't want to have them. And that's why we read books, right? That's why we go to the movies. Because when we watch Spider-Man or Iron Man or Wonder Woman, then we can, vicariously experience this adventure. And we see the hero answer the call and refuse the call and get tested and go through all the stages and come out victorious in the end. And we get to experience that rush without having to feel those dangers and those terrors actually within our own person. So we get to go on that journey, but we don't have to do the hard work ourselves. And it's not just that that's a voyeuristic and passive thing, that it has to be a bad thing. It's not that we are such cowards that we have to watch other heroes accomplish these great feats and we can't do it ourselves. It's also just a good learning experience, and that's what people do and have always done, is we tell stories. So every time that a kid reads a story or watches a movie, they're learning a little something about the hero arc and a little something about relationships and seeing what other people do and can do. So it's not just that we're, weak and we have to watch other heroes because we can't have adventure in our own lives. It's that we literally can't have an adventure every day because that would be reckless. And so it is fun and it is a good learning experience to have these adventures vicariously through reading or through hearing what other people tell us, stories that we hear from other people or from watching a movie. And another thing about that that's interesting to me is that that's one reason why a lot of people, how can I put this? Everyone is capable of telling a story, and even if you've never written a novel before or told a story of that magnitude before, we're all capable of it, and that's because we all know how stories work. We've all seen enough stories. We've been told them from the time that we were conscious, and we've read them in books and we've heard them from our families. And so we have a sort of innate understanding of story because it's built into us, and also because of the learning that we've done. And so, it does help. Like they say, it's good to write in the genre that you read. That's a common piece of writer's advice, is that if you've always loved and read romance, well, then it makes sense for you to write romance because you understand the tropes and you understand the way that a romance goes. Even if you aren't able to beautifully articulate what all those tropes are, you still, on some level, when you're making decisions while you're writing, you'll have a little bit more help of guidance by just being familiar with the romance and adding in those scenes that romance readers love because you've read them before. And so if you try to jump into a genre that you've never read, you're going to be bumbling around, and who knows, maybe you'll create something brilliant that people love and think is fresh and new and exciting, but it's a lot more likely that you're just going to turn off readers of that genre and they're going to feel like they didn't get what they signed up for. So for me, it was a pretty obvious choice when I finally decided that I was going to write a novel and that I was going to make this attempt to be a writer and a self-published author. It was pretty obvious to me that I was going to write fantasy just because that's what I've always loved. And I read The Hobbit when I was a kid, and I read the Redwall, Brian Jacques series, and fantasy was what I love, and it's what I understand best. And so it's taken me a lot of tries to find out. Eventually, if you write long enough and if you write enough words, really is what it comes down to, then you start to find your style. And I don't know when that will happen for me, but that's what I'm working toward. And the important part is that I write in a genre and in an arena that I understand, and also just that I'm most interested in, and that gets me excited. Like I said, my favorite thing is when it all comes down to it, I want to read about an adventure. And so it makes sense that I would write something along those lines. Before I forget, I have this thing pulled up on my computer. I have a bunch of quotes from different authors and stories that I've read over so many years. And when I was reading this Joseph Campbell thing, it called to mind a couple quotes that I had from The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, the famous Mark Twain books. And those are adventures in some of the truest sense, especially if you're, especially if you're American, because adventures have different flavors in all the different cultures around the world. And that's an interesting topic that I'm not going to go down that rabbit hole right now, but maybe someday I will. I have these two quotes from Huckleberry Finn that I love because they actually have the word adventures in them. I'm pretty sure these are both from Huckleberry Finn and not from Tom Sawyer. Here's what it says. I told Jim about what happened inside the wreck and at the ferry boat, and I said these kinds of things was adventures. And then the other one I had, this one actually took place before. Do you reckon Tom Sawyer would ever go buy this thing? Not for pie, he wouldn't. He'd call it an adventure. That's what he'd call it. And he'd land on that wreck if it was his last act. I wish Tom Sawyer was here. Oh, Huckleberry Finn is one of the all-time great adventures. It's that first one where he's with his dad in the shack, and his dad is a drunk and sort of a coward and just an all-around bad dude. And so Huck Finn's adventure begins when he strikes off from his dad. He actually ends up getting, his dad sort of goes crazy and locks Huck Finn in the house. It's really like sad and terrible when you actually think about it. But his dad was just this abusive drunk and all around terrible guy. And he ends up going crazy and actually locking Huck Finn in the house. And so Huck's adventure begins when he escapes. He actually gets away from his abusive father and gets out and escapes to this island in the middle of the river. And then he ends up going on this amazing river journey with Jim. And they go on the raft together, and they go all down the river through Missouri, and it recalls a lot of that Odyssean type voyaging on the water and facing all different dangers along the way as they go from stop to stop. And like all good adventures, Huck Finn is going to persevere, and he's going to eventually come back home with all of the knowledge and the wisdom that he's gained from being out there in the great, bad, big world. Man, I kind of want to reread Huck Finn right now. I have good news regarding my own story, regarding my own novel. That's that I've officially begun first drafting, which means that I'm writing new words every day, and I'm actually writing one scene after the other and trying to get as far into the story as I can. And I've been doing that going on 4 days now, so that's exciting. I haven't been in this writing mode for so long, and I know that that's the most important thing. When it all comes down to it, doesn't matter what you talk about, what you say you're going to do, what you plan to do. All that matters is what you're actually doing that morning, and whether or not you're actually putting words on the page with your ass in the chair, as they say. And so that feels really good to be doing right now, and to be back in the first drafting process. I've known for a long time that I was close, that I was almost ready, almost had enough of my outline figured out, enough so that I could at least start the story and get into it. And I know for the most part what I'm writing, and I finally did figure out the ending. Obviously, there's a lot of details. Writing a first draft is a adventure in its own right, because there are things that you know, but then as soon as you start writing, no matter how good of an outliner you are, things always change during the writing process. So I do know my ending, I know my main character, and I know my supporting cast, and I know how this story is going to start and how it's going to end, but I don't know all the details. And so this first draft is a scary adventure and a discovery, as well as it is just a project and filling out the outline and the things that I have planned. But it feels good to be productive, and I've been looking at because I'm writing the beginning of my story right now, I've been thinking about the call to adventure and the refusal for the call to adventure, because I've been thinking about it for my own character. So that's why I was looking at the hero with 1,000 faces this morning, and I like this copy that I have of Joseph Campbell's A Hero with 1,000 Faces. It's a really nice black hardcover, and so it's just fun to pick. It's a good coffee table book to pick up once in a while and just look through the pages that I've dog-eared, or things that I've underlined in the past. And so it was good for me to reread about the call to adventure and think about my hero, my hero is a young boy he's a young American man who comes to Korea for the first time, and he comes to Tomorrow City, and he is experiencing a new world that's strange and magical, and literally actually is magical, and a wild place for him. And it was good for me to read that difference in what Joseph Campbell said. He kind of gave two major examples for how the hero can be thrust into their adventure. He said you can either go forth on your own volition to accomplish the adventure, like Theseus did when he showed up in Athens and he heard about the Minotaur, or you can sort of be cast off or sent abroad is the phrase that he uses, like Odysseus, who was driven around the Mediterranean by the angered god Poseidon. So Odysseus was just kind of, someone had it out for him. Well, he angered the gods. I guess it was his own fault, his people's own fault. But he was cast off into the wilderness, and his adventure was just trying to survive, trying to get back home. And those stories are amazing too. That makes me think of one of my favorite all-time TV series, Mad Dogs, which I've talked about at length on this show before. But Mad Dogs is one of those Odysseus adventures where the four main characters are Americans who travel to Belize, and they think it's going to be a fun dudes trip where they're going to meet their old college buddy and party and get away from their families for a week and let loose. And it ends up being this terrible Odyssean adventure where they are just trying to get back home. They're trying to hold on for dear life, and they're trying to pass by the sirens without looking at them, and they're trying to defeat the one-eyed monster, and they're just trying to get home safe and get out of this adventurous world that they never wanted to be in. So this morning I was thinking about the difference between those two kinds of call to adventures, where the hero is either going forth by his own desire and proactively chasing that hero's quest, or the hero is sort of just thrust into it and forced to scramble around and survive and get back home. And I think that my story is more of the former. And maybe next week I'll talk more in detail about what I'm doing with my story. But for today, I wanted to think about the call to adventure and the hero's journey. And it's just always good to return to part of the storyteller's Bible, the storyteller's canon, one of the all-time greats, which is Joseph Campbell, and to get some inspiration from him. And then I can always just go off on tangents when I'm thinking about stories and the way that our own lives are stories, and the way that we all go on adventures or refuse to go on adventures in our own life. This writing journey has definitely been an adventure for me. It was one that you could say I avoided for a long time when I was younger. I always wanted to write a novel. I always felt like I should write a novel. I always, for some reason, always believed that I could write a good novel. But I was too afraid to try it, or the excuses were just too easy to make. And now I'm further along in that process, but I'm still in the beginning. Well, what stage would I be on the hero's journey if this writing journey of mine was clocked onto the hero's journey diagram? Where would I be? Well, I'd be somewhere in the middle. I can tell you that. I'd be somewhere in Act 2. I've already gone through Act 1, where I refused the call. I accepted the call, which was I said I was going to be a writer. I started this podcast where I told people that I was working on a novel. So I've already crossed the first threshold, which is the point of no return, which is where there's no going back. I can't just wake up tomorrow and pretend like I never wanted to be a writer, because I've already made it known. So I've crossed the first threshold. I've gone into Act 2, which is the Road of Trials. Yep, that sounds familiar. Definitely been going through the fucking Road of Trials. The Meeting with the Goddess. Woman as the Temptress. Atonement with the Father. Apotheosis, the Ultimate Boon. I'm somewhere in there, in the middle, with these podcasts that I've listening to and the writing advice that I've been getting. And maybe Joseph Campbell is my Yoda. He's the wise sage, or the what do you call that? He's the Gandalf. He's the Dumbledore that's giving me guidance along the way. So I'm somewhere along there in the road of trials and getting uphill, but facing more and more adversity as I get higher and higher up the mountain. And I hope that you will continue to follow along the journey, and I hope that me showing my struggles with this process will be helpful to other writers and other creatives out there. And I hope that we can all celebrate together when I finally break through to the other side and fight that last Bowser, which is the publishing villain. And hitting publish on this story will be the ultimate victory, and that adventure will be over, and then it'll be time to start a new adventure. But I can't get too far ahead of myself. That's one thing that's easy to do as creatives, is we think too far ahead into the future, and then we think, oh, how could I ever achieve something like that? And then it's just daunting, and then we give up. So I can't think about publishing or cover design or even editors at this point. I've been through this process before, and that does give me confidence, because I've first drafted 2 novels before successfully. And so I'm just going along with the process right now and trying to enjoy it and trying to be present for it every morning. And the first drafting process is a scary thing. I don't like it very much. I don't know if I've talked about this before, but what I really like is editing. Not like I want to be an editor, but like I enjoy revising my own work. So I love to go back, look at something I've written, and move the paragraphs around and strengthen the sentence and strengthen the descriptions and add a cohesion to the story that wasn't there before. That's what I really love to do. So it's really the later drafts that I really enjoy, where I can just do it for hours and hours and all day. But the first drafting is a pain in the ass. I don't really enjoy putting new words on the page nearly as much as I enjoy editing and recrafting the work that I've already done. So that's why it's hard, and that's why the only way to get through it for me, or for anybody, even if they love first drafting, is just to do it one step at a time, one piece at a time. So I'm excited to be going through that process now, and I hope, next week I'll give more updates, and so I hope you enjoyed this little exploration into the hero's journey and into the myth of the hero, and especially focusing on the call to adventure. I hope you're well wherever you are. I hope you're finding ways to be creative and to find peace throughout the busy week. That's my thing these days. That's what I'm focusing on. I'm in the regular grind of the regular life, and I'm in the routine. Everything's fairly smooth. I've been traveling so much in the last 5 years and having a lot of big changes that this is the most stable time of my life that I've had in a while, and I'm really hoping to take advantage of that, because as I've talked about before, stability is good for art. Adventures are good for finding creativity, getting, travel's good for getting new skills and getting new perspective and having input and filling up your well. But when it comes down to actually producing and being productive, what's good for productivity is having a schedule and having set times when you create, and having a plan and following through on that plan. So that's what I'm enjoying right now. enjoying the process, and I am tackling this first draft one scene at a time. Thank you everyone for listening. I'll be back next week with updates, and who knows what else, who knows what book I'll be reading from or what ideas I'll be spouting off next week. But this has been a fun journey. This podcast is its own kind of journey, and I'm enjoying this sort of midweek reflection that I have to do every week, but I also like to do because because I like nerding out on this stuff and talking about stories, and it's in my mind anyway, and so it's good to have a place to get it out and to get feedback from you guys and to kind of go on this journey with other people as well and not feel like I'm alone in the struggle. So thank you so much for listening, and I promise, as always, I will be back next week. Until then, happy Wednesday, everyone.